Yeah, nice. Okay, cool. I think I've kind of changed tack slightly from what was on the kind of like abstract thing of what I said I was going to present. Partly because I ran out of time to prepare a bunch of new slides, and partly also from just kind of overhearing kind of conversations yesterday, where I think I had like multiple times, like, I don't know, like, what even is this like cooperative AI thing? It like kind of makes sense, and maybe there's some like relevant bits that like Jin and others have already been gesturing at, but maybe it's actually not really clear. I think like exactly what I mean by that, and exactly like what sorts of problems I personally in that research community are interested in solving. So I thought I'd kind of give just like a little kind of whistle stop kind of tour and quick kind of overview and intro, and just to kind of set the scene. And then I'm going to hand over to other people, so Andreas and Casper and Anthony and various people who are going to talk about some actual kind of slightly more kind of concrete bits of work in this space relevant to this kind of question of how we might be able to use credible commitments and commitment devices in order to reach more cooperative solutions in general sum games. Okay, so I'm going to move through the first part like relatively quickly, because this is just like a relatively kind of intro presentation aimed at like people who are maybe potentially slightly less technical. And so I'm going to kind of gesture at things at quite a high level and really just focus on the scene setting stuff. And then I'm going to raise a few questions right towards the end about this idea of real world kind of test domains for deploying cooperative AI algorithms in, which I'm hoping that you'll be able to kind of like mull over a little bit as we're seeing some of the other presentations, and try to potentially kind of link this and think about how this links to work in the kind of real world settings that you as researchers and practitioners are involved in. Okay, so this is the outline, just a quick bit of motivation, talk about what cooperative AI is, talk a little bit about the real world, although I try not to think about that too much sometimes. And then I put discussion here. I don't know whether we'll have discussion after this or whether it's better more to move on to kind of some other things, but we'll see how that goes. Maybe some questions will come up during the talk as well. Okay. So this like field in general is motivated by kind of two things. And the first thing is like cooperation is really important. And the second thing is AI is going to be increasingly important for cooperation, right? And therefore we ought to think about AI in the context of cooperation. So the importance of cooperation is probably something that I don't necessarily need to tell you all about. But just that many of the kind of biggest and most important problems that we're facing are about problems of cooperation. So this might range from kind of climate change and war and pandemics and all sorts of things like this, all of the kind of global kind of coordination problems and challenges that we face. And yet also many of our greatest successes have been due to our ability to cooperate. So we have trades, treaties, collaborations, etc. And I think one of the takeaways here is that as societies and economies and industries, etc., become kind of more powerful, more interconnected, then the need for cooperation grows. So when we're all kind of little tribes living on little isolated islands at small scales, you know, you didn't really need to, I think the kind of cooperation tools that we could get away with using were kind of relatively primitive, and this was kind of all fine. And now that's kind of changing. And so this is the kind of second part of the story, which is that I think it's reasonable to think that advanced AI is going to both increase the power and interconnectedness of those actors, and therefore the need for, but also hopefully the feasibility of cooperation. So on the one hand, you might think that AI systems might exacerbate our worst cooperation problems. So probably everyone has like some idea of what this represents, but this is a little graph of the flash crash, which I don't need to talk about in this room because I'm sure you're all more than familiar with what that was. There we go. And then on the other side of the thing, you might realize instead, you might ask instead if we can actually kind of reverse the question, and maybe instead of AI making things much worse, we can in fact kind of leverage AI to make things a little bit better. And so this is what this incredibly trite and cliche graphic at the bottom represents. Cool. Is this advancing? Yes, it is. Okay. So one thing I want to pick up on, which just really quickly before I move on, which is also something that surfaced in Jin's talk the other day when he was talking about the space of commitment devices that you might be able to design and how that might kind of be useful at some levels, but actually then lead to kind of worse outcomes from a kind of welfare perspective, depending on kind of how you design that space. And this is basically the idea of this slide here. So in some sense, cooperative capabilities can be dual use. So forming credible commitments can be used to kind of make offers and so on and do all the things that we want to. It can also be used to make credible threats, right? This seems bad. Reaching mutually beneficial bargaining solutions could also lead to collusion when we don't want collusion. So I think it's interesting that I'll touch on this in a bit, but one of the areas that we already see sophisticated multi-agent systems already existing in the real world are markets and automated trading agents and so on. Actually, we usually think that competition there is a good thing. So we actually would be maybe less happy if a bunch of our automated trading agents suddenly decided to like start colluding with each other. This might be bad from the market's perspective, so to speak, because of the negative externalities induced. And then the final example is this idea that if you can form alliances and factions, that actually could lead to greater conflicts, right? So here's a picture kind of illustrating kind of the Cold War blocks in some ways. And actually, like, it was, partly the fact that these two superpowers emerged and could kind of gather so many extra capabilities and resources that precipitated some of the kind of worst crises of that event. And if you couldn't, in fact, join with your neighbors to try and like take down other people, then maybe this would be something that would be more avoidable. Okay, so ideally what we want is this notion of what I'll call differential progress on cooperation. So I don't know if this might already be something that's familiar to some of you, but here's a graph. It's a toy graph, it's not a real graph. And the basic idea behind differential progress is that you might want to give AI systems capabilities which can improve their kind of ability to cooperate more than it can improve their ability to do other things. And so, capability here could be some kind of cooperative capabilities, and capability here could be something else. I don't know. It's kind of gets a bit messy here, but the idea is that kind of, like here, like sort of for like most things, I don't know, obviously we have a bunch of stuff which is actually like superhuman at this point. And, maybe like image recognition's like here or something on this axis. And like, I don't know, writing novels is like here. And there's like a bunch of like, planning physics experiments is maybe like even less good or something. So there's like, we're like somewhere in this extremely high dimensional space, right? And then there's this idea that, well, what we really want to do when we're kind of navigating this space is to kind of steer development of AI systems in a way that kind of can give them better cooperative capabilities more than it kind of allows them to do other things. And the first thing you might think is like, okay, is this even possible? Is this even a coherent concept? Isn't just everything like arbitrarily dual use? Which I think is like an interesting question. Maybe like one like extremely minimal existence proof is that you can think of in kind of purely cooperative settings where you still face kind of equilibrium selection problems. So where coordination is kind of non-trivial, then you can introduce things like a cheap talk channel, right? So in a cheap talk channel, we can use that to kind of coordinate our actions together. And yet, worst comes to worst, you can just ignore what I'm going to say, right? And so it's not going to make anyone worse off necessarily. And so it might be interesting to think about whether there are certain kinds of capabilities or certain sorts of things that we can imbue our artificial agents with that have those sorts of properties, or that even if they don't kind of have no kind of downsides to them, might kind of steer us roughly in the right direction. So quick thing about what is cooperative AI is and what I actually mean by that. So I'm first going to talk about where cooperative AI is. So general project of making AI systems go well. And then you can kind of carve this up very crudely, at least, though not perfectly, into technical work and non-technical work. And then you can maybe carve things up in technical work into stuff like alignment and interpretability and robustness and cooperative AI and other things. And in non-technical work, you maybe have policy, you have norms, you have institutions, you have governance mechanisms, you have all sorts of kind of socioeconomic kind of standards and kind of practices, etc. And okay, wow, this is a little bit delay. So yeah, here's where cooperative AI is. So it's kind of interesting in that it's like technical. So we work specifically on kind of building better AI systems. But we try to solve problems that look a lot like non-technical and governance problems, which is maybe something that you are all also familiar with, right? Because this is kind of similarly sort of the kind of crypto value proposition in some ways as well. And then kind of like, so what is cooperative AI? So it's probably a kind of subfield of AI that aims to improve the ability of AI systems to engender cooperation between humans, machines, and organizations, by which I just broadly mean groups of humans and machines. And the basic aim is to help reduce risks. I thought I took this out, but this isn't X risks, which means existential risks, which is something I care about. But come and talk to me about that afterwards if you'd like. from cooperation and failures resulting from AI. And it forms, therefore, like a natural kind of complement to some of the technical work on alignment, as well as some of the non-technical work on AI governance. And so one other way to kind of cash this out is to talk about the task of improving the cooperative intelligence of AI systems, where one kind of like hand-wavy working definition is this, which is based on the rather well-known within the field of AI, at least, thing called the Legg-Hutter definition of universal intelligence, which is a kind of informal notion of what it means for any given agent to be intelligent, but it nonetheless has some very interesting kind of theoretical basis to it. And so the idea is that the cooperative intelligence of an agent is its ability to achieve high joint welfare in a variety of environments with a variety of other agents. And one thing I want to point out is that this definition focuses on capabilities rather than dispositions, right? So this is like, I in fact may be capable of kind of helping everyone to reach a very, very cooperative solution. I may just not want to. And likewise, I might like really like desperately want everyone to get on and for like the world to reach this huge kind of fantastic cooperative kind of outcome, and yet I might be unable to. And so there's a kind of distinction here between kind of capabilities and dispositions, which is related to this issue of alignment, which is like closely related to cooperation, but very much not the same thing. And that's something I'll touch on in just a second. In fact, right now. So what is alignment? You've probably heard about this. It's in the news a lot right now, but better or worse. So alignment is basically the problem of you have a human or you have some principle that you care about and you have an agent, and here's some kind of, and basically what you want, color denotes kind of preferences or objectives or something, and you want the other agents, the robots, to care or act according to the human's values. Great. That's what alignment is in a cartoon. Here's what cooperation is in a cartoon, at least as construed by me, which is you start with a bunch of agents and they all have objectives already, right? They're all got nice little colors indicating they all have nice little objectives. And what you instead want to do is you want to take them with their kind of preferences fixed as input to the problem. And you want to make everyone get on and to reach like good outcomes, where like good might be something like, I don't know, getting closer to the Pareto frontiers as like a first approximation of this, right? But then there are all sorts of other ways you might want to try and cash that out. And then like one kind of, again, extremely like cartoonish way that you can think about this is that sometimes people are like, oh, kind of, let's just focus on alignment, etc. Let's not worry about these like cooperation problems. But basically like alignment doesn't like get you all of the way, right? It gets you like part of the way, but then here we have just like a bunch of actors who all maybe have, you know, I have my AI system, you have your AI system, great, they're aligned. And now like, you know, we're going to be potentially in some kind of general sum scenario, and this might end badly for us if we're not careful. So we still also want to be working on this part of the problem too. So you can kind of compose these two things. This like more or less captures the kind of like broad problem from a technical sense of like making AI systems go well. And the one kind of alternative view on that is that alignment can be seen as addressing this kind of vertical problem, and cooperation can be seen as addressing a horizontal problem. So what do I mean by this? Here I'm indicating that by this kind of like vertical axis, I'm indicating some kind of like normative precedence, right? So we just in fact care about this agent and their preferences more than this agent. This is why they're kind of like delegating to that agent, right? Where this is like a little robot. And in kind of cooperation problems, we usually don't think that like any one particular agent is like privileged beyond any others, right? And so it's much more kind of at the same level of which we're trying to get them to coordinate together. And then obviously the world is really much more complicated than this. And in fact, the world is much more complicated than this picture too here. I'm sure you've all noticed that. And this brings me on to the real world, which is a segue that I didn't have in my head, but actually works really nicely. Yeah, okay, cool. So just quickly then just talk about kind of problems and progress in cooperative AI in terms of what people are working on at the moment. So you might first ask, like, why are cooperation problems in the context of AI different? Why is this not just like regular AI stuff / why is it not just regular like study of cooperation stuff, which has been studied in a bunch of different subjects for a very long time? So the first point is that cooperation can be harder because AI agents don't possess some of the features that allow biological creatures to cooperate. And equally, cooperation can be easier in some cases because AI agents have, or at least can be constructed to have, non-biological features that might also allow for better cooperation. And so these features introduce a range of kind of interesting open problems. Some of them are more or less open. So the first is kind of things about understanding, so the world, the behavior, preferences of other agents, and dealing with recursive beliefs. So I believe that you believe that I believe that you believe, stuff that comes up in game theory all the time. We can also think, relevant to this topic session, the ability to kind of form commitments via devices such as delegation, contracts, including hardware, and so on. We can also think about communication, so dealing with issues around kind of common ground, important problems of bandwidth, latency, teaching, learning, etc. And then finally, at a kind of meta level, we can also think about institutions more broadly. And this might be informal institutions such as norms or reputation systems, but they might also be kind of much more formal as well. And so then the thing that I want to kind of leave you with, and I'm going to kind of use this as an excuse to pretty much wrap up and hand over, is that I think one thing that the AI field likes is that to drive progress is like test domains and challenges and like things like this, right? So I don't know if you heard about the ImageNet competition back in around 2012, which really ended up driving much of the progress on deep learning and kind of highlighted to everyone how powerful these methods really were and kind of kickstarted a lot of work in that area, or a lot more work in that area. Obviously, it was going on for a long time. Yeah, in general, this is like a feature of kind of lots of AI research, is that people get hooked on these like specific problems and challenges and what sorts of tools and capabilities they can use to solve them. You might actually argue that this is now shifting away from this paradigm with the use of kind of these called like so-called foundation models and so on, where we actually just train some like massive system based on a lot of kind of like relatively unstructured data and information, and then fine tune it to help us solve downstream tasks. But nonetheless, I still think this is an important paradigm. So like with my field building hat on, which is like part of the work I do, then I want to claim that we actually need some kind of real world experimental test beds in which to empirically test cooperative agents. And this needs to have ideally kind of certain features, right? So the first is that they want to be kind of large and complex and actually relatively similar to real world problems that we are likely to face, but still kind of scoped enough to be studyable. Second, you need something that can be done kind of safely and in a at least relatively like low to moderate stakes way. Yeah, you don't want to accidentally like mess anything up too badly if you're deploying systems in the real world. You also need to be informative, so you need to be able to kind of like monitor these experiments and systems and actually gain relative information about them. And ideally, although this is always challenging in the real world, you want them to be to some extent at least kind of reproducible. This is all stuff about just like good science, right? Basically. And ideally as well, you also, as far as possible, want them to be kind of important and relevant to real world problems that people actually care about. So there might be something that's happening in the real world, such as, I don't know, I'm not going to be able to think of a good example, like the way in which like pigeons like congregate in certain parts of London or something. Like no one really cares about that, or like it's not that important. It's an interesting real world, it's like a real world problem maybe that pigeons end up in certain parts of London and you don't want them to be, and maybe you can like shepherd them into like various others. I don't know where I'm going with this example. But like ideally, if you want to hook people in, like image recognition comes up all the time. It's like a useful thing. This is partly why people are like, oh wow, image recognition. And so ideally you want to try and hook people in with something important, but also relevant. But in reality, there are actually like pretty few general sum sophisticated multi-agent systems out there right now. This probably looks like it will change in future. So I think this produces like then like a really open question of like, how can we start working on some of these things like at scale in the real world, trying out some of these kind of slightly more weird and wonderful ideas from the kind of computational sciences and so on. So basically it leads people to work on things like this, which is, I don't know if you've seen this, this is the AI Economist. If you actually look at the paper, this is just like a graphic that they made on top for the paper. The real world doesn't even look this. It doesn't even have 3D graphics or anything. It's like there's a reason this has like a grid right here. It's actually just an insanely basic grid world. But nonetheless, they put this on the website because it looks cooler. Anyway, but essentially what you end up testing in these things is you have like very primitive kind of grid world-esque models, and you do some multi-agent RLE type stuff and so on. And like, this is good and important for like testing intuitions, but as we all know, the real world has a bunch of kind of complexities which can't necessarily easily be captured by these things. So I don't necessarily want to be disparaging towards grid worlds because they are nice and they are very useful. And this is more like, this is my impression of like, this is what the real world is like. Of course, it doesn't look like this either. But this is meant to be in contrast to this. Okay, and the final thing I'm really quickly gonna do. So like, okay, this is like, think about this. Okay, your job for the rest of the afternoon is to like pitch interesting things about like where some of these like things that I've very loosely touched upon and things that you'll see much more detail on in the following talks, and just like try to think about like some of these ideas, because I think like I do think there are interesting synergies here. I think that maybe there's stuff that we can contribute, and maybe there's also stuff that you can help us by kind of like, you can help us get a nice shiny stick and point to your thing and be like, look, a real world problem, and we're going to solve it. And then, yeah, as a quick kind of plug to some of this, so I work at a place called the Cooperative AI Foundation. These are the trustees. So this is Alan Defoe. He's at DeepMind. Eric Horvitz, Microsoft. Gillian Hadfield. She's at OpenAI in Toronto. This is Dario, the CEO of Anthropic. And this is Rue, who's at Polaris Ventures, who's our funder. And we're a kind of charitable entity. We're a research foundation. We're a field building organization. This is kind of our mission. If you're interested, this is my like regular spiel slide. So we have a bunch of things that you can find out about us online. And I think you've already mostly done all of the further reading, because Jin was very insistent that everyone should read these things, despite the incredibly short notice. So you've already read these things, I guess. But like, if you want to read more things, come and talk to me, or read the papers that are about to be presented on, which maybe you will have also read by this point. But anyway, that's it. Yeah, I don't know what time it is now, / when there's time for discussions. 2:30? Fantastic. Thanks. We've actually got loads of time. So yeah, I don't really know. I could open it up, I guess, first of all, just in case there are any kind of questions or any things that anyone wants to kind of like raise or flag or chat about, or if anyone has any solution, interesting examples of these kind of real world problems and so on. That could be an interesting thing to do kind of like nowish. And then I kind of like slightly threw Andreas under the bus because I came to his talk yesterday morning when I arrived in London, or his poster, and it was really cool and it's relevant to commitments. So I've now invited him to give a talk in this slot instead, or as well as me. So he's very kindly agreed to do that. But I still think we have capacity. So I'm going to stop talking now. And if anyone wants to question, someone can do that.
When you talk about real world examples, you look at online auctions often. So eBay is one example where people are like, particularly whatever, but maybe more sophisticated examples like ad auctions as well.
Yeah, lots of people do work on this. I do not personally work on this. I guess this is like one of like the main applications of like serious algorithmic game theory and so on, which is like a very good example. Yeah, no, I've not really thought about that personally. But yeah, this is great. More like this, please. Yeah.
Like when they comment the name given in our race, or they get that from so I found very useful the description gave for distinguishing alignment versus cooperation. It does seem to me that what you call AI in the two cases might be different, or different levels of capability for different. In the alignment problem, you need the AIs to develop their own goals. You need an AI complex enough to have their own goals so that alignment is a goal. Whereas in cooperative AI, my impression is that with much less powerful AIs, you already have like an interesting thing to talk about, right? In the sense that if you're like thinking of AI as credible commitments, and you want to play some game with humans and with the like use of programs to like make the outcome better, you already have wrong there, and the AIs there don't need to have like have the capacity to develop their own goals. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, and I do agree that like alignment when you have extremely basic agents is like not that much of an interesting, or like not as much of a problem. Like the basic thing, you can just like train some like incredibly basic agent to perform some incredibly basic task, and like I don't know, it probably just does it first time around. If not, if it's incredibly simple, you could literally just like look at the algorithm and just like change it. This is just like the basic idea of like debugging code. Or even if it's doing something like slightly like not what you want, it's just kind of like operating on some like small system, and you can just like fiddle around with it and hack around with it until it basically works, and you can be kind of satisfied that it's going to do what you want it to do. And then if you have extremely like powerful and capable agents that are doing much more complicated tasks, potentially even tasks that humans can't really understand, right? So this is the ideal aim with AI research, is that machines will be able to do things that humans can't even do. And then as soon as you have that sort of thing, then it becomes, much more tricky with the alignment thing. And maybe cooperative problems like do emerge, like maybe like earlier in some sense, because it's like more feasible that things could be, kind of misaligned with each other, so to speak. At the same time, however, like we also, when games are small and when agents are simple, we can like just look at them using standard kind of game theoretic methods and kind of like analyze them and like solve problems and prove theorems about them in a kind of like quite nice way, in a way which we can't usually do with like big sophisticated AI systems. So I think that, both problems definitely like scale and get much more difficult with the complexity of the agents.
Yeah, I was interested in what you said about the biological features that should be either like avoided or maybe copied to facilitate cooperative AI. And I did agree with the premise, but like I was kind of wondering whether you had like more specific ideas of things that might be like nice to replicate in terms of biological features and things that should be avoided. Like what's your take on this?
Yeah. Maybe like one idea for a biological feature, which would be nice to replicate in machines, although it's potentially risky, is theory of mind. So humans have theory of mind, right? By which I mean I kind of like look at you and what you're doing, and I can make some pretty good inferences about what you kind of want or are thinking about based on your actions, because I happen to at least believe that your mind is sufficiently similar to mine where I can do this. And machines don't have really this notion. So kind of inference of intentions and so on, and intent is something that humans actually find mostly quite easy. At least like we sometimes think of it as hard, but mostly in complex settings, like most of the time it's actually pretty simple. And machines don't really have this yet. So this could be a good thing. And then, with the kind of like non-biological things, I'm thinking more about things like, the like speed at which machines can operate, the fact that they can operate in highly distributed settings, the fact that they are written in code, and we can actually like look, like in theory at least, we can look at code and like figure out what it's doing and why. Now this is pretty hard when you have big inscrutable neural networks, but this is why a bunch of people work on interoperability. And so, there are kind of things like that.
Have you just a small follow-up? Like, have you thought a bit more about maybe like the memory part of like what I can? Because it's been studied in AI, right? Quite a lot, like how models can forget and what you deal with that. And I was wondering whether you can like take inspiration on some biological features of actual human regarding memory and kind of I was just wondering if this was something I know.
Yeah, so there's definitely work about this in like the idea of like computational boundedness, obviously, or boundedly rational agents like does come up all the time in game theory and so on, and it is studied too in kind of like AI stuff. But my impression is actually like not as much as you would expect, given that like AI people, like, and at least CS theory people, love to talk about like computational bounds on things and like, like complexity stuff. And yet when it comes to like applying those sorts of ideas to kind of like games and kind of in multi-agent kind of interactions, my impression is that this has been done less. Nathaniel actually might be like a person who's able to like comment on this more easily than I, because this is like slightly more of his wheelhouse. But I don't know. Do you have any? Is that a thing? Am I like mischaracterizing? People actually work on this loads.
I would agree that boundedly rational stuff is less popular. Like it's pretty or I shouldn't say unpopular, but it's
Oh yeah, perfect. No, as well. Yeah.
So the problem is that mathematics is very hard to define it. So there is work in the last few years on mechanisms and bounded rationality for a specific form of bounded rationality, which is absence of contingent reasoning that works for humans but doesn't work for machines. There is work done by Alpen and Plus.
Yeah, I thought that's very good.
Who tries to model computational complexity in decision making, but they were by themselves. It's not being much big. It's not being picked up. Part of my work is trying to actually the techniques I've developed for, it's called object strategy progress, to see whether I can apply them to this Alpen and Pass computational complexity stuff. But it is complicated. And I agree, it's very much understudied, but it's because of in academia, there's risk versus rewards, right? So if you work on stuff that's hard and you don't publish, that's not something many people want to do. That's unfortunately the reality. And not that many people went through it.
Yeah, that is the one paper that I always think of. It's like, Halpin and Pass is like kind of, I think it's called like game theory with like computational costs or something.
ISP is cleaner, I think, as a mathematical model. But it works for humans, not for machines.
You set out and you mentioned the concept
of this strategy.
The reasoning.
Contingently. So it's basically people are not able to believe the ends in their head when they make a decision. Just I can give you, so this is experimental finding. If you run 7 price options with real people and you do it in silly fashion and in ascending price fashion, it's exactly the same option. So people should not play differently, but in practice they misunderstand the format much more than that. So this OSV concept exactly captures this difference between the relations. And there's also what I mentioned yesterday when in the Q&A with David, there's also work done on explainable strategy movements, which again tries to get to the bottom of why people understand certain options or mechanisms better. But I think in the AI or in this context, if the programmer of the AI system misunderstands incentives, we still have the same problem. Because they cannot call it up properly. I had a different question, but I don't know. I think you.
Yeah, I got a very quick question, which is, so I was thinking about ways of enforcing these collisions, right? A very interesting question is, how can you ensure that if there's a greater collision, it's not split up? And something that I was wondering, and has been obviously explored in the real world is credible threats. And an interesting thought could be whether enforcement would be from one agent onto the other. So, for example, if say some agent breaks from the collision, then the other artificial agents could leverage. I'm giving a very simple example, right? Could try to find some kind of vulnerability, right? Or a way to, attack and so forth. And the threat of this, given that these agents say are very capable or whatever, is, has the effect, right, of enforcing to some degree this collision. So my question is, has there been any, do you know any resources or work exploring threats among agents as means of enforcing these things?
I guess there's like loads of stuff on this. Like this is basically, for example, like what the Grim Trigger strategy does, which is the kind of source of the folk theorems in game theory, which is like some of the most kind of fundamental results, which is basically like playing an iterated version of like business dilemma or something, and you're like, cool, the way I'm going to get you to cooperate is if you like ever defect, I'm just going to like punish you for eternity or something. And at least in like infinitely repeated game. So yeah, and in terms of like coalitions, I think you can do this as well. I actually haven't worked that much on this kind of cooperative game theory type stuff where you think about kind of coalitions, but yeah, often there's posited to be some like mechanism via which you can in fact kind of like punish deviators essentially, and this is what allows you to form the coalitions to begin with. So I kind of mentioned threats as like an obviously bad thing, but it's actually far from true that they're an obviously bad thing, right? We have like socially kind of desirable kind of threats made all the time, right? Like the fact that the state has a monopoly on violence, and if you kind of go and do something horrible, you're going to get put in prison. Is like, that's a threat. If you do this, you're going to go to prison. But it actually just turns out that we want those sorts of things mostly. And so, yeah, I think it gets back to kind of Jin's point before about like, okay, like what commitments do you want agents to be able to make? What commitments do you not want certain agents to be able to make, and so on.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, like PvP between artificial agents, so to speak, right? Yeah.
I had a comment and maybe one other question. So no, your framework, you went human to agents, alignment,
Yeah.
agents to agents, cooperation, right?
Yeah, although you can also think of cooperation as like happening at like the level between kind of humans and AIs, or like humans and humans, or like any sort of agent where you don't immediately think there's like some kind of like normative precedence, I guess. So it's that what does the work. And usually we think of humans as having normative precedence over, say, machines. And who knows if that will be the case.
So sometimes, I have this example in mind of pricing algorithms where the alignment is perfect. So as a supplier, I want to maximize my reward.
Yeah.
So the agent does exactly that. And when they go into the world, there's an emergent cartel, even though they were not programmed to do the cartel, then they do the cartel. So which means the problem is in the societal alignment.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm trying to say. And this is much harder than maybe.
Yeah, definitely. But you also might think, and I think Casper might talk about this a bit later potentially, is that if we can in fact delegate to AI systems to make some of these decisions on our behalf, they could actually end up being like better at cooperating than we are. And so they might take our interests into account, but they might help us reach kind of more kind of cooperative outcomes. But yeah, fundamentally, there is definitely like a bunch of these problems are going to actually surface at the level of like societal kind of like cooperation problems instead of like what's happening at the agent level, so to speak.
Recent series were brought up about social cooperation. Do you have model norms or how AIs may learn some social norms that we have as humans incorporate them?
Yeah, definitely. There's a bunch of work in that area. It's not something I personally have worked on myself, but there are lots of work on kind of like, norms in AI systems and so on, norms in multi-agent systems, and various different ways of formalizing them as well. Exactly, yeah. So some people do it as kind of like these like logical constraints. Some people do it as like kind of soft kind of like losses. Some people do them as kind of like system imposed. Some kind of try to model the emergence of norms. There's very many different ways of approaching it. I don't necessarily think it's a solved problem, but it's definitely something that like people also
sound broad of more knowledge of studies. I think that.
Yeah. In general, I'm like kind of, which fits this audience, I guess. I'm like kind of like anti approaches where you have to rely on some like massive system designer who can just like impose a norm on like everyone else. Ideally, you want something that's kind of like self-sustaining and somewhat decentralized, because that is actually what's going to function at scale in the real world. And I'm also usually, a bunch of this like norms work was done in the context of like various kinds of like logics in multi-agent systems and so on, which was like very fashionable in the 80s and 90s and so on, and has not really stood the test of time if you ask me personally. I can say that because my supervisor isn't here. It was basically like the person who I don't know if anyone knows them, but I won't. Okay, thank you. I don't know.
Yeah, very cool. There's also work on like learning to training agents to like be able to learn what norm exists and like cooperate with that.
Yeah,
including SCR or the Center of Long,
which is where Nathaniel used to work. I also temporarily worked. In fact, I don't know. Is Anthony here? Anthony's worked on this. Is Anthony going to present later? I've forgotten the schedule.
Yeah.
Great. You can ask him about this. He's worked on this. And then like one kind of obviously interesting question is like, okay, so say we get to the Pareto frontier. Great. That's good. Now we just have to like pick a place on the Pareto frontier. all of a sudden that gets like pretty challenging, because you can think about kind of like what trade-offs to make between different agents and so on, and like what is right there. And it may in fact be the case that agents just have kind of different intrinsic norms about this. So maybe I adopt some kind of like total utilitarian stance, or maybe you're kind of like more of an egalitarian and you want to kind of like maximize the welfare of the kind of worst off person and things like this. And these things are then just like, in some ways, just can be kind of incompatible often. And so then there's a question about like, what do you do when you get to games with incompatible norms? And this is some of the stuff that Anthony was working on. So you can ask me about this.
Wait, I have another question. What does like field building mean?
Yeah.
In hell.
I guess it depends what kind of field you're trying to build. This is like an academic field. So field building in an academic field mostly looks like trying to build up a community of researchers and practitioners who are like dedicating their like working efforts to try and solve these problems. And in practice, what that looks like is doing things like helping like co-run events like this, or workshops, or we're doing a kind of contest at NeurIPS, which is the big AI conference that's happening in December. So there'll be a Cooperative AI contest there. We like publish materials online. We're hosting a summer school. We're going to like do kind of grant making. Yeah, sort of like what you'd expect. But yeah, if you have any ideas for how to do field building better, but also come talk to me and tell me how to do it.